Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
It's our tradition to go around the room and say our names. Before we hear from our speaker, I always like to encourage you to take a breath. We're not rushing through, but actually listening for the name that was just said. My name is Joe.
My name is Tom.
Jason.
Alan.
Harvey.
I'm Greg.
Roger.
Kevin. Ian.
Jose.
Jack. Francesco.
Larry. My name is Ray. I'm David. I'm George.
My name is Cass.
Dennis.
I'm Brad.
My name is David.
I'm Al. Peter.
My name is Matthew.
Jay.
Benjamin.
I'm Clint.
And who are you, young man?
Me.
I'm Shantanu.
Our speaker today is Benjamin Young. He began meditation as part of his spiritual practice when he was in his early 20s. Over the last 46 years, he has studied many spiritual paths, pursued a number of meditation practices, led spiritual retreats, and given spiritual talks. Benjamin traveled to India for 2 months in 2001, where he and a close friend took monks' vows. He's been practicing a Buddhist form of meditation called Anapanasati, mindfulness of the in and out breath, for the past 25 years, and assisting others in developing their spiritual practices. Welcome, Benjamin.
Already. Thank you for inviting me. To begin with, during the talks that I give, I usually like to dialogue, so if you have comments or something to add to what I'm saying or a question, please feel free to ask it. My talks aren't necessarily very well organized. They're more spontaneous. I sort of put them together over a period of time, but the organization is rather haphazard. And it's usually based on what's going on in my practice or what I happen to be studying at any particular time. So today, I guess the big influence in my talk would be a Hindu book called the Bhagavad Gita. How many of you are familiar with the Gita? And how many of you have read the Gita? And what are your impressions of it?
Yeah, I have a background in yoga, and so the Gita really speaks to me. I like the storyline of it and the conflict that's there for Arjuna.
What I'm sort of interested in exploring today would be a spiritual path and what that means. And the reason I picked the Gita is because it deals with defining spiritual path. Now, within a spiritual path, generally, we define a practice, and within a practice, we define activities. For example, meditation may be an activity within a practice. So, next question, how many people here have a defined spiritual path? What do you think is the benefit of having a spiritual path? Let's dialogue.
It makes you more conscious of your day-to-day living.
Okay, that's good.
Can I just comment that you made a distinction of defined spiritual path, and you just said what is the benefit of having a spiritual path? One can have a spiritual path, but not have a defined spiritual path.
I
something I would argue.
I understand. That's perfectly acceptable. I mean, you get to define spiritual path any way you choose.
And also, what I'm saying is the lack of definition isn't necessary.
I understand. I wasn't attempting to restrict the definition in any particular way. But how we see it is usually how we define it.
My spiritual path is sort of a default position. Like I go through life sort of wheeling and dealing, and then when I get fucked up, I go into my spiritual path.
Hi. So, as a person with ADD, having a defined spiritual path, which I'm working on what that's going to be, the definition of that is helpful, just in staying focused and kind of being more centered and less frenetic.
Mm-hmm. So, in a sense, one of the things a spiritual path does is it sort of provides some limits on how we focus our energy in evolving spiritually.
Let's leave that open because I need to keep an eye. There's nobody out there now. I need to keep an eye.
And the drums are fine.
So people who walk in off the street.
The Gita is a spiritual text that evolved in India before, somewhere around maybe 200 BC. And I recently read some commentaries on it which suggested that perhaps there was some interaction or interplay between Buddhism and Brahmanism, which was the predominant religion in India at the time, and that the Gita may have had influence on Buddhism and may even have influenced the formation of the Mahayana traditions. Just kind of interesting to think about. We tend to look at religions as being isolated and separate, but obviously Buddhism evolved in the Brahmanism environment, so in a sense it was a subset of the Hindu perspectives. It took pieces of the Hindu perspectives and accepted them and eliminated others or restricted others. The Gita is the central section of a major Hindu text, actually an epic poem called the Mahabharata. And it's a bit unusual in that it deals with a war that's occurring. And it deals with a conversation which happens in the middle or just at the beginning of the battle in the war. Arjuna, who's the central warrior in the Gita, is about to engage in a battle where he's going to fight his relatives. And he asks Krishna, who in Hindu mythology is seen as an incarnation of God or an avatar, who's driving the chariot for him, to pull into the middle of the battlefield where he wants to look at what's going to happen. And when that occurs, he is really sort of freaked out by the concept that he's going to have to kill many of his own relatives. And he considers that perhaps that's not the best thing to do. And his reaction to that is to, in a sense, abandon his weapons and begin to withdraw from the battle. And the Gita is actually Krishna, the avatar, the incarnation of God, explaining to Arjuna why he has to fight the battle. And in the context of our present day, I think sometimes that's a little hard to accept because it means that God is sort of advocating the slaying of other humans. And I think that's sort of off-putting for a lot of people when they look at the Gita. In reality, the Gita is about defining a spiritual path. And Krishna actually defines a couple of paths within it for different types of personalities. He defines a path of knowledge and he defines a path of action. He talks about other pathways as well, but those are the predominant pathways. Now, in a sense, the Mahayana tradition is really a pathway of action. And that's sort of a fascinating correlation because the bodhisattva concept is one of acceptance. So one of the questions that sort of arose for me is, would a bodhisattva in Arjuna's position take up arms to fight the battle? You think not? You're shaking your head no.
That's why I never completed the Bhagavad Gita. I was turned off by the warfare.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't give it a fair chance, but I wouldn't think that would be something the Bodhisattva would do unless the action of killing is, it's like what Buddha did when someone was about to kill some other people. He killed that person for what the story was.
Right. What Krishna points out is that the battle which is occurring is between righteousness and unrighteousness. And that for Arjuna to fail to carry out his duty would be an unrighteous act. To fight the battle is what was necessary because it would maintain, sustain righteousness for all of humanity. So, in a sense, perhaps, that may be the choice of bodhisattva. So we can't always sort of judge it based on moral perspective because, first of all, morality changes. And secondly, morality is rarely absolute. So it's sort of an interesting perspective to look at. Okay, secondly, within a spiritual path, we talk about a spiritual practice. So, how many people here feel that they have an established spiritual practice? Well, certainly within Buddhism, there are defined spiritual paths and spiritual practices. And to go back, actually I did a talk here a little over a year ago where I talked about the foundations of Buddhism. And of course, the first foundation is the Four Noble Truths. And they are, does anyone want to contribute? Come on. First noble truth.
There is suffering.
Right. Dukkha.
Dukkha.
Which is not necessarily translated easily into suffering, but certainly is on some level dissatisfaction. Or, yeah, let's say that, let's call it movement as an interesting way of looking at it. Second,
The cause of suffering.
so what is the cause of suffering?
We cause suffering
By
by grasping or
clinging,
aversion.
attaching, holding on to. So it's an action that we perform that produces suffering. Third, Buddha said there was a possibility for liberation from suffering. And he said the way to liberation is by leading a compassionate life of virtue, wisdom, and meditation, which is the Eightfold Path. So, if we talk about a pathway within our practice, then perhaps from a Buddhist standpoint, that might be the Eightfold Path. And one of the things I talked about before was how the Eightfold Path is really sort of grouped into three components, that is virtue, wisdom, and meditation or contemplation or concentration. If that's a pathway, one of the steps, which is the last step defined in the Eightfold Path, is right concentration. One form of right concentration would be meditation. What are other practices that people engage in within their spiritual practices besides meditation?
Engage Buddhism.
Which is?
Going out into the world and taking your practice out to the world with the idea of reducing suffering to some degree.
Right. Which is again, going back to the Gita, is defined as the path of action. Okay. What else?
There's devotional practices, bowing, smelling, anything that is uplifts you or is devotional.
Chanting. I'm sorry?
Tonglen.
Mm-hmm. So, metta. Mindfulness. So there are lots of different practices. One of the practices that we engage in is meditation. What's meditation?
Sitting still and being aware of your thoughts.
Okay. Anybody else?
Quieting of the mind. Quieting of the mind.
Okay. Anything else?
In addition to sitting meditation, I feel like meditation is focus on anything, whether that be washing dishes or focus on a person you're having a conversation with. Could be meditation.
I pulled out a definition just so we would have a framework to work in, and the definition was techniques and practices designed to concentrate and focus the mind.
What about insight? The third training.
Uh-huh. What I'd like to do is to add, within the context of this environment, a perspective, just for discussion. Again, I'm just putting out some information based on my own experience and practice. And as I said, just for discussion. Within the Zen tradition, meditation is called Zazen. Dogen described Zazen as just sitting and referenced that as an enlightened experience. So I'd like to sort of view meditation as an experience of enlightenment. Does that work?
Sure.
Okay.
What do you mean?
Yeah, it's like a taste of enlightenment?
I'm sorry?
A taste of enlightenment? I'm
No.
not sure.
No, not a taste, just enlightenment.
What do you think of the idea that Zen says that, or certain teachers would say that it's just an art, it's just the art of sitting, it's just the art of being present to what is?
You know, one of the things about the process of teaching is that you gauge the environment that you're in, and you put out information that's going to be useful to the people who are experiencing the teaching. So, we could talk about, the Gita in detail and all the different aspects it represents. We could talk about mindfulness practice and how one engages in it, and we could talk about Tonglen, and we could define each of those as meditation. So, just as a reference point, I thought I would toss out the perspective of meditation being an enlightenment experience. So, to sort of put that in frame, I thought that perhaps meditation is being, not doing. Just as a thought. And I went back to the Gita, and I pulled something out for reference, which is out of the second chapter, which is the way of ultimate reality. That's the title of the second chapter. And these are slokas 62 and 63. And I'm going to read you the slokas, and then I'm going to read you some commentary about it. It says, when a man dwells on objects, he feels an attachment for them. Attachment gives rise to desire, and desire breeds anger. From anger comes delusion. From delusion, the failure of memory. From the failure of memory, the ruin of discrimination. And from the ruin of discrimination, the man perishes. Commentary. A beautiful image appears. The tendency of the mind is to repeat it. Then, if the image is allowed to recur, a liking grows. When the growth of liking With the growth of liking, the wish to come close, to possess appears. Any obstacle to this produces wrath. The impulse to anger throws the mind into confusion, which casts a veil over the lessons of wisdom learnt by past experience. Thus, deprived of his moral standard, he is prevented from using his discrimination. Failing in discrimination, he acts irrationally on the impulse of passion and paves the way to moral death. Thus, Krishna traces the moral degradation to those first breaths of thought that come softly and almost unconsciously to the mind. Actually, if you took Krishna out of it, it ends up sounding very Buddhist. In fact, it sounds like the formation of an individual, or as it's referenced, dependent origination within the Buddhist tradition. Again, going back to the perspective that teachings provide us lots of interesting sources for information. Frequently, the problem is that it's hard to put them within the context with which they were presented. For example, Buddhism evolved in a concept of reincarnation and the presence of deities. Today, reincarnation may or may not be acceptable to an individual's perspective, and deities may or may not be acceptable. But within the Buddhist time, those weren't questions that were asked. Those were just the way things were. So when you look at those teachings, one of the things you need to keep in mind is that that was the perspective of that particular culture at that particular time. And obviously, it would have done no good for the Buddha to attempt to teach outside the culture. No one would have listened, because we have basic beliefs that help to define how we interact with others and who we are. And it's important to recognize that those are not constant. They're continually changing. So, when a man dwells on objects, he feels an attachment for them. Attachment gives rise to desire, and desire breeds anger. From anger comes delusion. From delusion, the failure of memory. From the failure of memory, the ruin of discrimination. And from the ruin of discrimination, the man perishes. So, how can we relate this back to meditation? Any comments?
Well, I guess, I guess it just means you're just being aware of this change in a way that you were previously conscious to it. So maybe you're able to keep that cycle from happening in one of those steps.
It's a little like in meditation, chasing a thought as opposed to letting go of it and realize it's a thought. And suddenly you're, in a sense, it's all part of meditation, but in a sense you're no longer meditating, you're thinking through tomorrow's breakfast or something like that.
Right. So what happens is a subtle arising thought is a very disruptive force. And if indeed we're capable of sustaining meditation, then indeed what we're doing is we're somehow not becoming engaged in those subtle arising thoughts, which is what this whole pathway defines. This whole sequence of events defines how we become attached to something. And once we become attached, basically it means that we perish. Not literally, but in a sense we're drawn out and away. We get lost. Again, sort of very Buddhist in perspective. The Gita also talks in another section about what's called the way of action. It's, I think, sort of fascinating that the Gita says the most direct pathway to enlightenment is basically the wisdom pathway, the pathway of knowledge. It also says it's extremely difficult. That means to indeed awaken our awareness within the environment and to let go of all of our attachments is very, very difficult and only accomplished by very few. And he says that the pathway of action, although it doesn't lead directly to enlightenment, is a much easier pathway to follow and provides the foundation for basically following the path of wisdom. So the path of action is we try to, in a sense, align ourselves with the world that we live in and try to produce some level of harmony within our own lives. In other words, to follow our Dharma. And Dharma has a number of meanings, including teaching, but it also helps to define pathway. So, in a sense, Dharma and pathway are the same. But the Dharma pathway isn't necessarily a religious pathway. It's not like we go out and we follow Buddhism or we follow Christianity. It's really we follow the pathway which provides the most support for us within our life. And as you said before, it doesn't necessarily have to be rigidly defined, but it still has to have some definition for us. You might say a part of that is differentiating between what we consider right and wrong, taking actions which we feel are in alignment with the way we perceive things. All of those things produce some level of harmony that form the basis for a practice. Chapter 3 of the Gita is the way of action. And I pulled a comment out of this one as well. It says the senses are superior, they say. Superior to the senses is the mind. Superior to the mind is understanding. And superior to the understanding is he.
Heat?
He. H-E.
He.
Therefore, know him who is superior to understanding. Control the self by self, and destroy the enemy who comes in the guise of desire and is hard to overcome. So, who is he? Gita is suggesting that we have several aspects. We have a self aspect, and in the Buddhist tradition we have a no-self aspect, which is also self. The self aspect is really the way we perceive ourselves in the world and the way we present ourselves. The no-self aspect is that aspect of us which is, let's say, less engaged. Call it the more profound aspect. You can call it subtle awareness, beingness, whatever you wish. It pretty much correlates to the self that's referenced in this particular sloka, or slokas. And in a sense, when we engage in a practice like meditation, one of the things we're attempting to do is to step outside of that self, which is the distracted self, and to engage or abide in that aspect of us, which is the non-distracted self. So if indeed we succeed at that, what we've accomplished is we've had an enlightened experience, because abiding in no self is, in Buddhist tradition, an enlightened state. By the way, one of the words that we encounter frequently in Buddhist tradition is nibbana or nirvana. So, what is the definition of nirvana? We hear it a lot. We use it. What does it mean?
I thought that that's what the state of being enlightened
Is
I thought that it was the state of being enlightened that was
okay.
that.
Eliminate the state.
So it's enlightened.
Enlightened. Yeah. The word itself means to snuff out. To cool. So if we put that in the context of what I was talking about, what does that imply?
Extinguishing the small self and abiding in the profound self.
So in a sense, this self, as we perceive ourselves, we might consider to be heat. We might consider our engagement in the world to be a heating process. And as we engage, we're basically high. So nibbana, or nirvana, is a cooling, which means a withdrawal from being in that heated self to abiding in that non-heated self. Or as you referred to it, the little self, which is the ego, or the ego representation, versus the big self, which is the all-encompassing. So, again, just perspective. So how does that relate to meditation and enlightenment? I wrote another little thing down when I was thinking about what I wanted to say, and it says, don't meditate with expectation, meditate for meditation's sake. So, how might we engage in meditation as an enlightenment experience? In my practice, my meditation has a pre-meditation and a meditation. So what I've attempted to do is I've attempted to produce states which facilitate my having that enlightened experience during the meditation process. And if you search the teachings, be they Hindu or be they Buddhist or be they Christian mystic, they all generally point to the same thing. And that is, somehow we have to figure out how to cool the mind. So, how do you cool the mind? Well, the first step to cooling the mind is to figure out how to relax the body. Because a distracted body means a distracted mind. The two are connected. In fact, we make a separation between them, and they're not really separate. They're all us. They're all a manifestation of us. So the process of beginning practice, at least the meditative practice, is to find a way of producing a flexible, relaxed body. Well, if you go back to the Gita, Krishna talks about a particular form of yoga, which involves stretching the body. And you know, it's what we tend to see as a representation of yoga in our culture today, that is, some physical activity, which involves stretching with the intent of opening up the body. To some extent, it's become a physical exercise practice, which it was never intended to be. It was always intended to be the foundation for a meditative practice. So it's this relaxation process that we engage in, so that the body's in a place that we can actually lay the foundations for having that enlightenment experience. In Hindu tradition, breath was very important. How we breathe is very important because it's one of the things that's a natural part of our life activity. Within the meditative process, and it's also referenced by Patanjali when he talks about yoga practice, or within the Gita, and that is pranayama, which is actually managing or controlling the breath. So what can you do with the breath within a meditative practice? Well, I looked at the breath as having two components. We breathe out and we breathe in. And what's the difference between breathing out and breathing in? I associate the out-breath with death. Okay, I didn't get a reaction. The last breath we breathe is an out-breath. But it's also a relaxing breath. So not only does physical activity produce relaxation in the body, but an outward breath produces relaxation in the body as well. Not only does physical activity produce relaxation in the mind, but the out-breath produces relaxation in the mind. So we have this piece of information that we can use, which is the out-breath. And if you look at practices like Anapanasati, it deals with observing the in and out breath. The interesting thing about the sutras that talk about that particular practice is they don't really tell you very much about the practice. It says you look at these different aspects of the breath, and it doesn't tell you what you should conclude from those. And there's a tendency for us to look at it and think that it's just about observing what's going on with the breath. In fact, frequently you'll hear teachers talk about, let's take a look at our breath. Watch the in-breath, watch the out-breath. So why are you watching it? Well, for one thing, it provides a point of concentration. But secondly, you get to learn a lot by seeing what occurs when the breath is happening. There's a distinct difference between breathing out and breathing in and the way it affects you. So what I did was I broke my practice into watching the out-breath for a significant period of time. And what I learned was that it produces a very relaxed state. In fact, if you just observe the out-breath for a long period, you become very dull. You become so relaxed that you become mentally dull. So what about the in-breath? If the out-breath is death, what's the in-breath?
Life.
Got it. It's an enlivening process. In the tradition, Buddhist tradition, it's talked about brightening the mind, which means that it produces higher levels of energy. In fact, if you're finding that you're very mentally active in meditation, then by strengthening the out-breath, you quiet the mind. And if you find you're very dull in meditation, then by strengthening the in-breath, you eliminate the dullness. So why are these important? If what we're attempting to do is to find an ideal state for that enlightenment experience to occur, then perhaps what we want to be able to do is to find a balance between that relaxation point and that enlivening point that we can sustain, which means a balance between how we breathe out and how we breathe in. And it's a skill that you can develop as a preliminary practice for that enlightened meditative experience. It produces a perfect state because the mind is still, relaxed, and focused. But it takes practice because it's hard to observe the breath without being distracted. It takes a long time for that to happen. But once it does, you find that the experience is one of just pure experience. It's not necessarily what one would call mindful. It's not necessarily what one would call pleasant or happy, but there is a subtle joy associated with it. And in the Hindu tradition, that state would be defined as Satchidananda, which implies three components: a beingness, a consciousness, and a blissfulness. The difficulty is that we have the experience and practice, but there's a lot of effort which goes into translating that experience into something that goes beyond the sitting practice. How do you effectively take that into your life and utilize that experience? If you work on aligning your life along the lines of your Dharma, then it becomes easier to carry that experience into your everyday practice because there's less disharmony to disrupt the experience. But again, that takes practice and dedication. It also means that that point where we've learned to let go of our attachments, kinds of things I was talking about earlier when I read this, it gets easier to experience those states. But you still have to have at least an indication of what those experiences or those states are like, and that's what the meditative practice provides.
Question?
Sure.
So is the idea to try to move from a vacillation between the kind of relaxation on the out-breath and the stimulation on the in-breath into a consistent state, that so that you're not feeling relaxed on the out-breath and but you're cultivating a consistency.
Yeah, and the cultivated state is one of stillness. Really, if you can cultivate both of those components, the resulting state is one of a still mind, because it's very balanced at that point.
So balance is what.
Yeah. Yeah.
My experience is, I've heard it called the first jhana, which is called rapture. But it's kind of like a steadiness of intense pleasure. That's all I could, that's what it's like. It's very pleasurable, and there's a stability to it.
That's true. And you're talking about the first jhanic state.
Yeah, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, there are actually 4 jhanic states. Mm-hmm. And as you effectively move through the balancing process, each of those states appear. And each one is a refined sense of equanimity. The first formation, the first occurrence, is one of rapture, which is a physical excitement, a physical joy. The second level, where rapture, the physicality disappears, is one of mental joy. I'm sorry, the first one is really developed concentration. The second is the physicality. The third is the mental joy. And the fourth is equanimity. So that's a very balanced state. But the problem is, even though in a sense that's an experience of having divested oneself of attachment to the ego, the difficulty is that it's only sustained during the practice. So you might call that an enlightened experience, but not a perpetual enlightened state. There are also 4 states above that, by the way, which deal with dissociation of self, complete dissociation of self. Meditation can be very technical. One of the interesting aspects of Buddhism is that it turned meditation into a very technical practice. Sometimes that's overwhelming. Most Hindu perspective says that the ideal pathway is one of devotion. What goes on in the practice is that we're attempting to let go of our ego definitions. We're attempting to let go of the heat, the cooling process. In devotion, what you do is you give up your self-identity. You give it up to a deity. So, in a sense, what you're doing is you're trying to cool yourself by letting go of your self-identity. It's just different practices with different perspectives. Still gets to the same point.
This is getting sort of literal, but I wanted to understand. I've never heard people talk about in-breath, out-breath like this around meditation, because I'm fairly new to the practice. When you say strengthening the in-breath or the out-breath, do you mean lengthening? Or making it more forceful? Or?
The practice itself is one initially of observation. What you do is you observe the impact of the in-breath. You observe the impact of the out-breath. And then you draw your conclusions about what need to be done to create that balanced state. It's not like someone can sit down and say, oh, you need to lengthen your out-breath. You need to lengthen your in-breath, or you need to shorten them. It's that the observation process will bring you to an understanding of how to utilize that breath in your practice. That's why if you go to a teacher who's going to talk about a practice, what they're going to tell you is you need to observe your breath. The problem is frequently we get that piece of information and then we spend the next 20 years watching the process rather than figuring out that maybe there's a little more to it than just watching it. Anything else? Any other comments?
I had a question.
Sure.
You know, all of this description of meditation seems very intellectual to me, to some extent. And I know it's not. In my understanding of it, it's sort of like a scientific experiment. That this balance comes as a result of just doing this, right? And it's not like you're setting out to get balance. It just occurs, doesn't it? I mean, it's like, am I wrong? Or
For some people it just occurs.
Uh-huh.
For others it doesn't.
Okay.
Just like for some people their perspective of the world is intellectual, and for other people their perspective of the world is emotional, or some other state. My perspective of everything is very intellectual because that's the way I am. You might say that's part of my dharma. So I don't necessarily advocate that people take that particular approach. I'm just putting out some information that you can listen to and see if there's anything useful in it, and if so, then you can take advantage of it. Otherwise, just let it go. The fourth chapter of the Gita is the way of renunciation. And it says, those who are free from lust and anger, who have subdued their minds and realized the self, those sannyasas, both here and hereafter, attain freedom in Brahman. Shutting out all external objects, fixing the gaze of the eyes between his brows, equalizing the outward and inward breaths, moving in his nostrils, controlling his senses, mind and understanding, being ever bent on liberation, ridding himself of desire, fear, and anger, such a man of contemplation is indeed always free. So, the reason that, part of the reason that I chose to talk about the Gita is because I think that if we're flexible enough to recognize, first of all, that these come from other cultures with other perspectives, just like Buddhism did, just like Buddhism is for others, there are pieces of information that we can glean from them that may be very useful to us in how we evolve our practice, our pathway, and hopefully open the gateways to Nibbana, or freedom from suffering. So, are there any other questions or any other comments that people would like to make?
I have a comment about the Gita. People often consider the Gita by itself, and it really is one moment in the life of the larger epic Mahabharata. Looking at it by itself would be something like looking at a person in their 22nd year of life and saying, this is what the person is about. But if you saw the person over a span of time, especially towards the end of their life, you would have a very different understanding of that person and what's motivated them and what's made them act and what they're all about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with the Gita, I have somewhat the same problem with the Gita, that I don't know your name, if you're sitting.
Right.
Ray. Okay. It's a, you can read it as a really deeply conservative text, because what it's saying is when you have decided what the right course of action is, even if it is warfare and killing your cousins and uncles, then you proceed on that path, letting go of, but you don't do it for personal glory. You let go of your ego. Okay, so that's a really conservative, just long justification for something truly horrible, killing, war, and it's even worse when it's put in the mouth of God Himself, who's advocating this. But going back to what I was saying earlier about looking at the text within the context of, the epic that it's a part of, there's something really interesting that happens in at the end of this epic. So Arjuna is fighting. This epic is told from the point of view of the family of Arjuna, and they are consistently presented as being righteous, and they're acting against the other half of the family, the Kurus, who are not righteous. So, you read this entire epic, and it's longer than the Iliad, going along thinking that this is presenting a family that is righteous, but what happens at the end of the epic is that and there's general mayhem, and almost everyone, except for the family of Arjuna, dies. And then they go to heaven. And who do they find in heaven? But the other half of the family. It would be something like going to heaven and finding Trump. But what the text is doing is really asking, if you look at the full text, what it's really asking you to think about is the ways in which we justify what we are doing. And then it pulls the rug out completely from under your feet. And the reasons why the other family are in heaven are never actually clarified. But it leaves you with this question of...
Because they are part of the world dynamic, that's why they're in. They hold, because the world is all this. The world is both good and dark. It is all of it. And that's the role we're supposed to play, is what we play.
Right. But my point is the answer is never given.
It's in the text. It's there. It's telling you right there.
Just
the world is.
I'm sorry to interrupt for a second. A couple of points. First of all, it's generally accepted that the Gita was added to the Mahabharata, that it is not part of the original text.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, that this is not a text that is like the Bible, that you don't add to the Bible. At least you didn't after the 4th century. But this is a text that's been added to, and so different arguments have gone into its making.
So, and I agree with you. It's interesting to put it within the context of the Mahabharata, but I don't see any problem in considering it as a separate text as well. Secondly, the interesting thing about I'm sorry, I don't quite know how to put it into words. I'll come back to it in a moment. Any other comment?
I see the context of the Gita, and by the way, I've been meditating for 45 years, and one of the things that's helpful in meditation is to look at what I'm doing, because I sat, and I've gone through Zazen and mantra meditation and Bhakti and Tonglen, and you name it, I've probably done it, because I go, what is there? So it's helpful to get some intellectual perspective to give me a context of my experience. It doesn't make it right, doesn't make it wrong, but it just gives me a little bit of framework. Go, I see what they're talking about. Back to the Gita, I see it as more of an allegory for my own personal war. my own personal war with my mind, my passions, my desires, my attachments, and then finding a way through that to recognize that I do have a dharma, I do have a pathway, and it's not always clear, and it has refined itself over the entire life. And as long as I stay with that, things feel much calmer, and my mind is much calmer.
One of the interesting points that one of the commentaries I read said was that the reason that particular environment was selected as a representation, in other words, a war, is because we live on a planet of violence. And it wasn't just referring to the fact that humans attack humans. It was referring to the fact that life is based on destruction of life. And it was just a representation of that fact, which sometimes we sort of lose contact with. We feed on life in order to survive. And that's the nature of this reality. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why the Gita represented these teachings within an environment of war. Just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any announcements today?
Just want to say in relationship to all this, at ACT is going to be presenting Peter Brook's Mahabharata, a section battlefield, it's called. So if you want to go see a play that is dealing with the context of what we're talking about, Peter Brook is a famous British director. So should be.
What is ACT?
American Conservatory Theater?
Okay. George?
Yes, I'm your host, George, and we rent this space, so Donna is a practice of giving to help us pay the rent, and I'll be coming around the Donna Bowl. Suggested donation is $10. And there are treats out there. There are organic strawberries and Murcott mandarins from Rainbow this morning I bought. Please help yourself and enjoy them. The mandarins have a seed or two, unlike the pixie one, so watch that. They're delicious, but not a lot of seeds, just a few. What else? Oh, and sometimes people meet at the door at 12:30 to go out for lunch. And if you want to get on our email list, there's a sign-up sheet and then hall outside. Thank you.
Any other announcements? Let's gather together. By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. And may all live in equanimity, without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.